Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to lesson number 3 of our series of Journeys of the Soul. This week, it seems like every week the conversation gets a little more intense. And tonight we're going to focus on the mourning period, the time after someone passes away, from a psychological, emotional, and from a halachic Jewish law standpoint. And the questions that we are going to be addressing is, number one, how does one mourn and heal from the loss of a loved one? And what is the ideal way to comfort someone who has lost a loved one? Okay. To begin with, a quick introduction. Many people assume wrongly that Judaism creates rituals that are meant to push us from stage to stage without taking into account the individual mourning and the individual emotions of different people. And that is that by definition, halacha is what we would call cookie cutter, where everybody is treated the same and everybody is meant to behave and think and feel the same, when it's obvious that no two human beings are the same. And just as no two human beings mourn the same, no two human beings can heal the same. No two human beings can grieve the same. And so any methodology and any system that would be designed to create an outline of how we should behave at the very outset suggests that from a Torah perspective, we expect everybody to be able to put aside their individuality and the individual circumstance of what they're going through to behave in a certain way. And actually nothing could be further from the truth. The Judaism validates and encourages individual paths, certainly when it comes to the mourning process, and no two human beings go through it the same way. But what we wanted to start with is explaining that much of the emotions that people go through is against the backdrop of emotions that we are projecting of how we feel about whatever situation we are going through. And certainly sadness, anger, injustice, guilt, the many emotions that we go through can be worked through if we all begin with the knowledge that as we have been discussing for the past 2 classes, that those that pass on indeed do live on, and they are not diminished by their death, and that life is a deposit from the Almighty, and a deposit is always and only given for a specific period of time. And so it's known in advance. All of us know before we come here that we are here for a certain period of time, and that whoever made the deposit can at any time recall that deposit. And no matter how we perceive the events of life, every person has a mission in this world. And for the soul and its unique mission, this constitutes the fullest life possible. So in other words, there is no such thing as someone who deserved more or who deserved less. We take the perspective that every person has a mission, and some people's mission is longer, some people's mission is shorter. We'll get to that soon. And finally, it's never too late to improve our relationship with those who have passed on, that our connection, that life is not over once a person passes on, if we were to always keep in mind that even after someone passes on, not only can we keep a relationship, we can actually improve our relationship with those who have passed. It will take away some of the sting that we may feel as well. And so let us begin with with a very difficult conversation right at the outset. And that is, what I want to address is what I'm addressing in my introduction is, how is it possible to have a system where Jewish law and Jewish tradition enacts, whether it's time or ritual, and we expect people to go through these stages that are predetermined, when obviously no two human beings are the same, think the same, behave the same, feel the same. How much more so when we compound this issue that no two human beings, in a sense, are going to relate the same way, because no two circumstances of someone passing away are the same. Many people will say, you know what, Rabbi, I can understand if a person lived to be 119 years and 364 days year old, and they passed away. That's the nature, that's a cycle of life. The person lived a full life to up to 120. We should celebrate that. But how about if a person passed away young or in a tragic accident? Can we apply those same emotions, those same parameters, those same holistic messages that we can tell ourselves that all is okay and that the person lives on and that we can maintain that connection, and we don't have to feel sad after the period of prescribed mourning, when it's obvious that people are going to react to one type of situation in one way and to another in a different way. So I want to begin with two case studies, okay, to illustrate why it is that we're going to begin with two people's very different experiences of loss. I'm going to read from you that from a number of studies that were done by psychologists at Columbia University. And the first one is an excerpt from Resilience in the Face of Loss, from the clinical psychologist at Columbia University, from George Bonanno. And this is what he writes. So he says, imagine this scenario. Heather Lindquist was in the kitchen cleaning up after lunch when she hears a dull thud. It sounded like it came from the hallway, but it was just a little too loud to ignore. She yells out to her boys, "What are you up to?" But there is no answer. She finds her boys playing quietly on the couch. They're giggling. But what was that sound? They shrugged. "Where is your father?" Without waiting for an answer, she runs to the hallway when she finds her husband, John, writhing on the floor. He had severe asthma. He was taking a new medication. It had seemed to be working, but suddenly he collapsed in the worst attack he had ever had. She tried to do everything she could to save her husband's life. She called an ambulance. The rest was a blur. He died of cardiac arrest on the way to the hospital. So she describes that she was 34 years old. Her boys were 5 and 7. At that moment, her husband's death felt like the worst thing that could have happened to her. She had lived her entire life in the same quiet suburban community in northern New Jersey. She and her husband had been high school sweethearts. They had married, purchased a small ranch-style home. They had children. They had the dog. Good schools. Community was stable. The American dream. But then her husband dies suddenly, as she has to rethink her entire life. She's a single parent. She has to find new ways to earn income and to find extra time to be with her children. And somehow she also had to contain everyone else's anguish. She writes that she found strength she did not know she had. It was lonely and painful, surely at times, but she found meaning and even joy in the idea that she was going to make it. I expected to collapse. I really did, she said. And that's what I wanted to do in the beginning. It would have been easy It would have been the easiest thing to do. But I couldn't. Each day I got up and I did what I had to. The days passed and somehow I got through it. My boys were great. They were upset at the beginning, of course. We all were, but we stayed together. I know my husband would have been proud of them. And we made it through that time. I contrast that with another individual, a woman by the name of Stephanie Moldberg of Short Hills, New Jersey. In 2004, Stephanie lost her son, Eric, to Ewing's sarcoma, which is a horrible bone cancer. 4 years after her son Eric's death, Miss Moldberg, who's now 48, still walks around like a zombie. I felt guilty all the time, she said. I felt guilty about living. I couldn't walk into a deli because my son couldn't go there any longer. I can't play golf anymore because my son can't play golf anymore. My life was a total mess. I couldn't even talk to my friends about it after a while because after a while they didn't want to hear. They would say, Stephanie, you need to get your life back. But how could I? On birthdays, I would shut the door and take my phone off the hook. My son wasn't having any more birthdays. Why should I? My friends, I start with this because these are two obviously radical different responses. And my question we would ask is one healthier than the other? Is one person in denial? Is one overreacting? Why would two people react so differently? And obviously, it's a silly question. Number one, we understand that no two people react the same, and there's no right way and no wrong way to expect someone to react to loss. But if we were to analyze as well, I'm sure some of you would say, if I were to open up and some of you weren't so shy, you wanted to chime in about how, if you were a psychologist, if you were a rabbi, if you were someone advising someone, how would you understand why one person can have a reaction that they overcome, that they are able to continue living? Would you call that person that they're in denial, they haven't expressed grief? Is another person overreacting 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, that they cannot reacclimate and join the living again? Is there such a thing as overreacting? Is there such a thing as being in denial? Or do we need to accept that people are people and no two human beings can and should be expected to behave in a specific way? Certainly, a scientist or a doctor can come and say, well, some people are just more emotionally resilient than others. That's true. And perhaps that's part of it. But the easy answer is not always the correct answer, because no two circumstances are alike, just as no two human beings are alike. Because every situation will have its own considerations. One person can lose somebody suddenly after a relatively brief period of suffering, and they have other children that they have to live for. In the second story that I read to you, Stephanie Moldberg, her son died from a terrible, awful form of cancer, a terrible illness that involves a long, prolonged period of suffering, and that's agonizing. And it's different losing a child when we don't know if she has any other surviving children or family members. And someone who's left alone and doesn't have maybe another reason to continue living, and that loss dominates her entire existence. Because every situation is so different, comparing people's situations are problematic. And so the reason why I begin with telling you these two true stories is because even if we can understand and accept that every situation and every circumstance would be the same, and they obviously never are, people are always going to react differently, depending on their emotional sensitivity and many other psychological factors. And so before we discuss whether there is a good way or a proper way to mourn and to grieve, we understand that human beings are going to respond and cope in many, many different ways. And that no one should be faulted or judged, God forbid, the way they experience this process and the way they react to grief. But ultimately, Torah tells us that every person can, no matter how paralyzing the grief and the trauma, every person can eventually reemerge into life. And the Torah gives us the process how that can happen. And so what we want to do tonight, is go through the Torah, use the Torah as a guide, and see how the Torah guides us through this the most difficult time in someone's life following the death of a loved one. Now, some of it we've discussed the past 2 weeks, but until now, we've discussed all of these things from a theoretical perspective. That knowing that the soul continues and the real person is still alive, and that they will come back again, as we discussed last week, and that we can still communicate with them, and that the soul is present at the gravesite. We can always go connect if we go visit them at the gravesite. And that even though there's a trauma of a separation between the body and the soul that takes place in the person who's deceased, they derive tremendous benefit and love from us doing things on their behalf. Although those things are true, but these are all discussed from a more spiritual perspective. Today, we're going to be looking at it from the perspective not of the soul of the person who has passed on, but from the perspective of the survivor who are bereaved. You know what's interesting, and that is the Torah literature and the Talmud emerges from a time when it was not so obvious that that mourning is even appropriate or ideal. You know, way back when we go back to the history of Western civilization, the architects and the founders of Western civilization were very critical of people who mourned. They viewed it as weak. They viewed it as unsophisticated. And they did not think that death was worthy of being mourned. Socrates, the famed 5th century BCE philosopher, Socrates, teacher of Plato, had an annoying habit of challenging the accepted wisdom of his time, which made him very unpopular, especially the ruling class. Some of you may know that Socrates was eventually put on trial and found guilty of corrupting the minds of the youth of Athens and of impiety, meaning not believing in the gods of the state of Greece. Socrates was sentenced to death. Shortly before Socrates was executed, as he was visited in prison by a number of his disciples. In the course of the conversation, Socrates asked one of his disciples to relay the following message to another of his disciples, and I'm going to read you the words of Socrates to illustrate that a true philosopher, a true thinking person, actually should be someone who is not afraid of death and who doesn't look at death as a tragedy and should not mourn death. Socrates instructed, "Please relate the following message to Avinas, my student. Bid him to be of good cheer. Say that I would have come after me by immediately leaving this world if he be a wise man and not tarry, and that today I am likely to be going, for the Athenians say that I must." Simmias said, "What a message for such a man, having been a frequent companion of his. I should say that as far as I know him, he will never take your advice unless he is obliged." "Why?" asked Socrates. "Is Avinas not a philosopher?" His student replied, "I think that he is." "Then tell him that he or any man who has the spirit of philosophy will be willing to die, for he will not take his own life, for that is held to be unlawful. The day may come when you will understand why, though a man is better dead, he is not permitted to be his own benefactor, but must wait for the hand of another." I read you this because Socrates was actually offered the opportunity to escape, They had bribed his disciples, had bribed the prison guards, but he chose to stay and meet his end and not escape. Many of the historians believe that the reason why he chose to stay, because if he were to run, it would indicate that he had a fear of death, which Socrates believed no true philosopher should have, because if you are a true philosopher, you're the spirit of the mind, then you should have no fear about what's coming, because true freedom is outside the body, not inside the body. So I mentioned this because if the greatest minds of the time of 500 BCE, the time of the rabbis of our Mishnah, the time of our temple, the prevailing wisdom among wisdom was that there's no reason to mourn death. Death is a natural part of life, and actually one should look forward to it and not be afraid of it. You contrast this with Jewish law. In Halacha, it says, Maimonides quotes it in the laws of mourning, Mitzvat aseh lihitabel ala krovim, we are biblically commanded to mourn the deaths of our next of kin. Why? Why does Judaism disagree with Socrates, with Plato, with Aristotle? Why does Judaism disagree with the great philosophers of history who say that we shouldn't? After all we've been discussing until now, that Judaism also believes that death is not the end. Our soul is eternal. The world that we live in, as Socrates must have felt, is filled with lies, deception, and evil. Why would someone be afraid to leave a world of lies and harshness and jealousy and pity and pitiful anger? Why should we not celebrate going to the next world, the Olam Ha'emet, the world of truth, the world to come? Maybe the Jewish reaction is we should celebrate. We should not be so sad. Nachmanides, the great 12th century rabbi and commentator on the Torah, writes that the Torah does not forbid us to weep in response to a death, because it is human nature to be moved to tears when separating from loved ones when they are journeying away. And as Maimonides also explains in his Guide to the Perplexed, that crying and mourning actually has a cathartic benefit. That rather than denying basic human emotion, Maimonides 1,000 years ago wrote that mourners find comfort in crying and in arousing their sorrow until their bodies become weak and the intensity of their internal turmoil. He says you contrast this, just as happy individuals find contentment in various forms of lighthearted activities, people who are mourning need to have that outlet to cry and to mourn. It actually helps them arouse their emotions that are bottled up and allows them to go through a natural process. In other words, what Maimonides is saying is that mourning is not a useless reaction of just crying. He says it has psychological benefits, it's healing, and it actually brings comfort to the person who's mourning. I want to read you one more text from a rabbi called the Radvaz, Rabbi David ben Zimra, who lived in the late 1400s. He was one of the great halachic minds of his time, and we have some 10,000 responses from all over the world that people wrote to him for halachic guidance. This was a question that he was sent to him by someone from a different town, and the question was posed to him as follows. He says, one of our generation's greatest personalities, a Gadol Hadar, a great rabbi, tragically lost one of his children. And it was noticed that when people went to see him, to visit for Shiva, when people went to him, they noticed that he did not even shed a single tear. He did not cry. Is this a praiseworthy reaction? They're asking this rabbi, that this rabbi was able to be in such control that he did not shed a tear, he did not mourn and cry for his child. This is the response of the Radvaz. The Radvaz writes, in my opinion, such behavior is offensive and objectionable. It demonstrates heartlessness, distasteful character, and cruelty. This is the way of the philosophers, the non-Jewish philosophers who maintain that this world is without purpose. The Radvaz is referencing Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, all the great Greek and Roman philosophers who said that mourning and crying for someone who died is useless, without utility, and is weak. By contrast, he writes, we have received the Torah and we are expected to believe and realize that this world is of great value for those who properly utilize their time here and behave appropriately. It is through our actions only in this world that we merit the Olam Haba, the world to come. And therefore, crying and mourning properly and shedding tears over the passing of a relative, and especially for an honorable individual, is the way of the pious, the prophets, and individuals renowned for their good deeds. It is not for naught that our sages instruct us to observe 3 days, Shiva, Shloshim, and on wearing new clothes and not wearing new clothes and getting haircuts. If weeping and crying were improper, he writes, our sages would not have instituted a 3-day crying and 7-day Shiva period. In fact, he says the first time we find this in the Torah, in Parshat Chayesara, it says that when Sarah passed away, Vayavo Avraham lispod l'sara v'livkota, that Abraham came to eulogize for Sarah and to weep for her. And then he continues. We find the same for Jacob, who cried over his children, for King David, who cried over the son that died. King David had several children who died in his lifetime, and he mourned and cried openly for all of them. And countless individuals, even of high caliber, and likewise, and therefore, the Radvaz says, the Jewish perspective is radically different than even the moral philosophers of antiquity, and that is, that it's not human frailty, but mourning expresses a Jewish theological truth that Torah obligates us to feel pain, to express the loss, and to go through a series of mourning, even though Torah recognizes that no two human beings are going to process loss the same way. But number one, we have to recognize that loss needs to be registered. It needs to be accounted, and we need to be present. Once we accept that the Torah expects us to be emotionally vulnerable and to feel that we have to honor the memory, the event, and recognize our own individual journey through this, then we can go through how different people will react to it differently. But to express and to mourn, we must. And so I need to combine the emotional, psychological, and the halachic in one class, as it were. And so the Torah rules for mourning are limited to the following next of kin, right? Father, mother, sibling, spouse, son, daughter. Those are the biblical mandated people that we have to mourn for. And so when the Torah goes through the many stages, it's validating and it commands us to go through each stage because it recognizes that even though we are going to experience it differently, as a general process, we all have to be shepherded and we all have to go through the main gateways of mourning. The first time period the Torah recognizes is immediately after someone passes away. The survivors are known as someone who's an onain, or the period of aninut, which means the period of time when a person passes away until the burial is called aninut, which means a person is so overwhelmed that halachically the person is not, the survivor is not obligated to observe any of the other mitzvot, because their full attention should be by providing interment arrangements and being present with the deceased and not having to deal with outside issues. So someone who's an onain is not obligated to pray, is not obligated to wear tefillin, is not obligated to make blessings, is not obligated to go through the structure of a normal day, halachically, because we recognize that that first stage is when a person is still numb. Until a body is buried, a person is going through the cycle of coming to terms with what happened. And the Torah says at that point, there's no rule, there's no set idea of what a person should be told to do, even from a halachic perspective that he had been doing every day up until that point. And so if you look at your screen, you will see the time period. The top is called aninut, from passing until atonement. We are absolved from every type of activity that requires an activity. And the immediate family members tear part of an outer garment to express their grief. Once the person is interred, that begins the process of the Shiva and the Shloshim. And so immediately afterwards begins the 7-day period, of which are included the Shloshim, the 30-day period, the 3 weeks after that. I'm going to put up some of the classic halachot that come into play during that period of time. We avoid wearing any new clothes, no haircuts or shaving. No festive events. We do not go to weddings or parties during that time. For all family members, according to Torah, other than a parent, the mourning period officially ends at Shloshim after 30 days. The halachot of mourning. Obviously, Kaddish, the prayer of Kaddish continues, but the laws of mourning, of not shaving, taking a haircut, clothing, going to parties, that concludes at Shloshim. For a parent, it continues for the rest of the year. And that's entirely a discussion, because those are part of the laws, not because the loss of a parent is harsher, just the opposite. Losing, God forbid, a sibling, a spouse, or a child can be much more traumatic. But because of the Torah obligates us to honor our parents of Kibud Avayim, the honor that goes on for an entire year, even after the Shloshim, that we mourn for them. It's also a custom that people keep a candle burning for the entire 12 months of the first year as well. And then, of course, we get to the time period of the anniversary, known as the Yartzeit, recitation of the prayers. Okay. And so what halacha, Jewish law, attempts to do is to provide a track. I'm sure many of you who got tragically, or God forbid, had to ever go through this process. People tell me all the time, Rabbi, the Jewish perspective and the Jewish process of Shiva, Shloshim, the 12 months, is not just ingenious, it's actually something that allows the people to be preoccupied in an active way of recovery. I meet many people who tell me, if only we had a way to mourn in a constructive way rather than sitting around and just feeling sad. The Torah gives us a structure. The Shiva is a time when people come to the home. and to offer support and to be with you at a time when it's very difficult to be alone. But at the same time, after Shiva, to step back and allow that person to grieve in the way they can grieve as an individual. And the Shloshim is a way of marking time, an entire month, that every single day we're consumed with what we can do for that person and what we cannot do, what we'd like to do, but we don't do for that person. And so what the Torah is doing is giving us this track of allowing us to behave through function and relationship, as you see on your screen. Because on the one hand, human beings, when we sit around and we do nothing and we're prisoners of our thoughts and our emotions, that can be just as debilitating. And so by requiring a person to create a function in their life that I can actually do something proactive, that I'm mourning in a very specific way, and at the same time, I'm preserving and increasing my relationship. So let us look at some of those, what we would call the two-track process. Because in track one, what we would call function, is the Torah helps us gradually get back to being a functional human being. And also allowing us not to feel that by recreating and re-emerging our functional part of our lives, we are deserting and leaving behind our relationship aspect of our lives. It's not an either or. What keeps many people stuck is if they feel they'd like to move on, but they can't move on because they feel it's being dishonorable to the person who passed on. And they feel like they have to live, the only way to live with that, keep that person's memory alive, is for me to be stuck in time the way I was at that moment, and I don't move on either. Or the reverse, people numb themselves and they throw themselves at work or finding other interests to distract them from what they are actually meant to be going through. And so what Torah is doing is, the halacha is the process of being able to balance both of these crucial points, and that is recognizing that we have to function as human beings and we have to reemerge into life, but it's done gradually, and it's done in a way that honors the process, at the same time recognizing that it's not a choice. We do not leave behind those who we love by living, and we do not run away into distraction in order to escape what we feel we cannot tolerate. And so the Jewish mourning process addresses both perspectives. Psychologists, because I'm not going to take you through time because it's going to take a long time, but up until the 1980s, most psychological studies of grief focused on one of these two different areas of function versus relationship. And it took a long time for people to realize that people were stuck in one of these two modes. And what the Torah always showed us is that we cannot and we should not choose. We have to be able to handle both at the same time. The Torah is addressing our emotional, cognitive, and physical aspects at the same time. So let us look at maybe what some of the psychological aspect. The first halacha is that what's called kriya. Many of you have seen this at a funeral. Halachically, that's supposed to actually be done at the moment of the most extreme sorrow. Halachically, that's usually done if a next of kin is present at the time of passing. You're supposed to tear kriya at that time. I want you to know that there's actually the halacha, the original halacha tradition was that every single person who was in the room at the time must tear their clothing. We discussed it, I believe, in last week's class, that just like a Sefer Torah, every soul, when it leaves its body, we tear kriya, and that's something that's obligated on everybody who's in that room. We find in the Torah that when the brothers who sold Joseph, and they came to their father Jacob and they told him, do you recognize this coat of your son Joseph that's covered in blood? And immediately he recognized it and he says, this is my son. He has been torn apart. He has died. And what does it say? Vayikra Yaakov Simlotov. Yaakov tears his clothing and he mourns his son. We find that throughout Tanakh, when the first sign of mourning, the first exhibitable sign of mourning is the rending and tearing of garments. Why do we tear garments? Why is Kriya such a important part that if it's not done at the moment of passing, it is done at the funeral, where the rabbi will come and instruct the mourners to tear their garment and make a blessing of Dayan Ha'emet. I'm going to read you from two opinions of our sages as to the theory of why we do Kriya, of why we tear garments. And they are actually opposite, they're coming from opposite ends. One opinion is that it was a way of distracting people from at that moment, from their terrible grief. And by giving them something to tear, they have so much pent-up emotion or anger or sadness. It was a way of not allowing their sadness to overwhelm them, and the tearing of something, just like when you emote very, very strongly, you feel like you're ejecting emotion from you, and it allows you to calm down afterwards. Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz states he states that's the reason. There's a Rabbi Yehuda Ayash, a 18th century rabbi from Algiers, writes that the real reason that mourners are instructed to rend their garments is it brings mourners to tears and it amplifies their pain. The goal is to actively encourage mourners to express their pain over the passing and to be able to experience the loss. So he writes, the visceral act of tearing is an expression of the unbearable pain and allows people to understand that we're going through something that's unbearable, that we cannot intellectually fathom. And so tearing allows people to realize that we cannot rush this process and go back to normal prematurely, but we have to be able to feel okay to exhibit what we are feeling on the outside, not just on the inside. We all recognize, we don't have to read all the studies to recognize that just as it's detrimental to overdo, people who keep emotions bottled up and don't have the opportunity to mourn properly, months, years later, they are still suffering the effects of it. So the Jewish way, in summary, is there to find a gradual but a progressive emergence from one step to the next to allow us to re-enter society, but not too quickly and not too slowly either. On the other hand, the Talmud in the Tractate of Moed Katan tells us that one is not to cry overly more than necessary, nor to eulogize more than what is prescribed. But how are we expected to act, the Talmud asks? Is there one way for everyone? The Talmud says, this is the halachic guidance the Talmud gave for all Jews. 3 days to cry, 7 days for eulogies, 30 days for restrictions. Once these have elapsed, God declares, and as you see on your screen, you are not more compassionate than I, meaning that since it is God who declared this series of times of mourning, and that after the 3 days, after the Shiva, we emerge into Shloshim, After the 30 days, we go into the 12 months. That means what God is saying, that God also experiences loss. Every time someone passes on, of course, God is present. What God is saying, that someone who mourns so excessively that they cannot move from Shiva to Shloshim is demonstrating that they feel pain more than God. And God is saying, you are not more compassionate than I. And that God's compassionate justice and God's decision arouses within us a level that we cannot agree with, and that we think that we need to have more compassion even than God is. Now, I do want to emphasize that, as I said multiple times in the beginning, everyone mourns differently. And for some people, 3 days of weeping will not suffice. Others will not be ready to emerge immediately after Shiva as well, or after Shloshim. Nevertheless, the principle remains that according to halacha, according to Jewish law, extraordinary and extended mourning is not what God wants from us. God wants us to mourn, but he wants us to mourn within a certain framework. If our feelings have not caught up where we need to be, we need to focus on our energies on moving to the next stage, and our actions by the whole foundation of halacha in many ways is allowing us to behave in a way that our emotions catch up with our actions. One of the revolutions of Judaism is that Judaism is a religion of action, of deed, not primarily a religion of faith and belief, because belief and faith come to people at different stages. No two human beings are the same, like we said, and believe the same way. And a person can wait their entire life to feel ready, emotionally ready for something. But one thing we know, human beings are creatures of habit. If you want someone to be kind, you don't say, please meditate on being kind for a year and then you'll be more kind. No. Judaism tells us, act kindly. Again, even if you don't feel it, keep doing acts of kindness. You know why? Eventually, your emotion, your character will catch up with your action. If you behave in a way enough, if you talk pleasantly enough, you'll become a more pleasant person. If you smile, even when you don't feel in the mood of smiling, eventually you will find yourself more cheerful through that response. And so the idea of halacha always was that when people always ask, how can the Torah command us to behave in a way when I don't feel it? It doesn't feel right. The answer is that human beings may never feel right. We're never in the mood, right? But what does that mean? It means that, of course, we need to be emotionally and psychologically there if we can. But that doesn't preclude us from behaving until that point. We get up and pray even if we're not in the mood to pray. We light candles, we put on tefillin, we observe Shabbat, even if that Shabbat we're not in the mood. Why? Behaving in a specific way, being kind to people, honoring our parents all the time, even when we're not in the mood, allows us to be able to honor them also when we're in the mood in a proper way, because we condition ourselves to behave a certain way. We actually begin to feel that way as well. And so I want to emphasize that obviously, even though we are complex organisms, but the Torah halacha applies to everyone, because the Torah recognizes that in our deepest truth, we are all the same. We have the same soul. Yes, we emote differently, we think differently, but the Torah gives us a guide to teach us that if we behave in a prescribed way, ultimately the Torah tells us that God who created us tells us this is the healthiest way. The healthiest way is to recognize that we have to mourn, but we cannot lose ourselves in mourning. And if we're not ready, we're not feeling, do things, behave in a way, and then you'll slowly see yourself being able to catch up emotionally as well. But don't jump, don't skip. Go through those processes. People who skip, who don't properly sit Shiva, people who don't properly observe Shloshim, also find that their recovery is stunted and they feel emotionally wounded. Many of you know that if you've gone to visit someone during Shiva, the hardest thing to be is, what do I say? What do you tell someone who's sitting Shiva? How do you start a conversation? Besides saying, I'm so sorry for your loss. And you feel like sometimes when you're saying it, that person has heard it so many times, he's not even listening, and it sounds so trite, and it sounds so simplified. What can a person really say? And here again is the brilliance of where everything is taught to us in halacha, and that the people who are mourning are aware of that halacha as well. Number one, you should know that when you go to visit someone and for Shiva, God forbid we should never have to, you are not supposed to initiate conversation. You're supposed to wait for the mourner to speak first. The mourner, obviously, as long as the mourner is supposed to be aware of that. But in all things being equal, we are not supposed to go in and just make, polite conversation. We sit there in silence, waiting for the mourner to address us, and then we engage in conversation. Before we depart, there is a specific prayer that we recite. You don't just say goodbye, I'm sorry, hope to see you next week at the club. What do we say? Many of you are familiar with it. Hamakom yenachem etchem b'toch sha'ar avelei Tzion v'Yerushalayim. May the Almighty console you along with the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. This was meant to be something that everyone should say in uniformity. It gives us something to connect with. We don't just go walk away. Why? Because the first thing we want to address when we are leaving a Shiva home is that we are all playing a part in God's world. And the same God that gave us life is the same God that moves us onto the next stage. But that's also the same God that gave us the laws of Shiva and commanded us to go visit the person. And what we want to tell the mourner is that the ability to find comfort comes not from people just coming and smiling and bringing you cookies and strudel, but it comes from God himself. There's nothing that anyone can possibly do that can serve as sufficient comfort. It is only God above, from God above, that we're given the ability to find comfort and consolation. People say time heals all wounds. I disagree. Time can dull, certainly with time, but time essentially doesn't heal. God heals, but God heals many times through the medium of time, but time is not an injection. Some people need a month, some people need 6 months, and some people need a year, some people need multiple. But we tell the people that the God who created us all, that's where the comfort will come from. In addition, the term that we've used, I've discussed it with people in the past. I've heard it many times. I heard it from the Rebbe once discussed, and I find it very moving. That the Rebbe asks, why do we use the term hamakom instead of the classic name of God? Hamakom means the place. It's not the classic term of God. And the Rebbe once explained that the word hamakom means the place because when someone loses someone, they lose something. There's a void now that's devoid of space. They lost someone that took up a physical, tangible space in their lives. And now there's a loss, there's a void. Who's going to fill that void? You, I? None of us can possibly fill that void. None of us can possibly understand what is missing in that person's life. We pray that we say Hamakom, the Almighty God, who fills the void of everything, who fills the void of the entire universe. There's not one space of the universe that's devoid of God's presence. He is Hamakom. He is all of place. Only God can fill that void. And that's why we don't use the regular name of God, because we want to emphasize that what we want is not just good thoughts, not consolation. We want to feel a physical, a filling. We want to feel the void that's been created should be no more. And that only Hamakom, only the Almighty has the ability to restore. In addition, many people ask me all the time, Rabbi, why is it that we say such an impersonal greeting You're comforting an individual who went through a terrible loss, and we always have to mix in Zion in Yerushalayim, Zion in Jerusalem. You go to a wedding, and before the groom smashes the glass, Jerusalem. Before we leave a house of a Shiva, Jerusalem. We know Jerusalem is important, but why? Jerusalem is something that the whole Jewish people are waiting for or are mourning for. But tonight, at this moment, we are talking to an individual. It seems very impersonal to bring in a statement that says, oh, I can sympathize with you. You know why? Because I'm also semi-mourning, because we're all mourning for Zion. We're all mourning for Jerusalem. And when that gets restored, you'll find your happiness too. Why can't we just, Hamakom yinachem etchem, for your loss? Why do we have to bring in Zion in Yerushalayim? What is it adding? So I want to share with you a beautiful teaching as well from the Rebbe, and this is from a letter. If you can open your heart for a moment, this is a letter that was written in 1967 to, at that time, IDF General Ariel Sharon, later Prime Minister of Israel Ariel Sharon. In 1967, Ariel Sharon lost tragically a young son by the name of Gur in a terrible, terrible tragedy. And the Rebbe wrote him a series of letters following that. And this is an excerpt of this letter that I'm going to share with you that was made public. The Rebbe writes, I want you to know in regards to Zion and Jerusalem, that the Jewish tradition is to comfort the mourners. You should know that this is not an add-on. It is the essence of consolation, because the Romans and before them the Babylonians were given dominion only over wood and stone, silver and gold of the temple, but never over its inner spiritual essence, because that is contained within the heart of each and every single Jew. You know, he says, our enemies, the ancient Babylonians and the Romans who destroyed the temples and sent the Jewish people into slavery and into exile, were only given control over the physical manifestation of the temple, but they never destroyed the real temple. The real temple is each and every single one of us. Over this, he continues, the nations have no dominion and no power. It stands eternally. We just read this in the Torah. The Asuli Mikdash in the portion of Shabbat, this past Shabbat, Pashat Truma, the Asuli Mikdash v'shachanti betocham, and the Shalah writes that it says, you shall make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in them. It doesn't say I will dwell in it. The sages always told us that the real temple that God wants us to build is the eternal sanctuary within every single one of us. That cannot be destroyed, and that's why it's in plural, I will dwell in them, even though there was only one sanctuary, one Mishkan, because God says a Mishkan can be destroyed. The wood, the beams, the gold, the silver can be captured. But the essence of what a temple is, the holiness, the relationship between God and the Jewish people that was forged at Mount Sinai, that can never, ever be destroyed. The Babylonians and the Romans never destroyed the true holiness of the temple. So too, he continues regarding the mourning of an individual. He tells General Sharon, death dominates only the physical body and concerns of the deceased person. Never, however, the soul. The soul, however, is eternal. It has merely ascended to the world of truth. It is indestructible. It only changes form. Sorry. If even physical matter is indestructible and it only changes form, how much more so the spiritual soul, which is immune to the forces that deteriorate the physical. While death might spell the end of one form of a physical existence, our spiritual self, our soul, lives on and is never, ever diminished by death. In other words, the mention of Zion and Jerusalem, as you see here on your screen, is that we want to highlight, it's an act of comfort. It's not just saying, oh, we are all mourning Zion and Jerusalem till today. It's actually the reverse. What we are saying is the reason why the Jews have survived The reason why Torah has survived, the reason why we as a people have survived, is because we've always understood that when something is destroyed, only its most external aspect of it changes. The truth, the essence of it, is unperturbed, is exactly as it always was. If that is true of the temple, of the holiness of the temple, we go to the temple, we know the temple site retains its holiness. Any of you have been at the Western Wall, and we're going to do a meditation in just a moment. You can feel that presence. Then you will realize that this is why we mention Zion and Jerusalem, because we're telling the individual that Jerusalem is real, it's still here. The temple is still here. Just because we can't touch it and we don't physically see it doesn't mean it's not manifest, it's not holy, the space is not holy, and it's not coming back. It is. And that's why when we comfort someone, we're telling the individual that a human being is exactly like I mentioned last week, it's like a Torah. It's a temple. We are walking temples. A temple can be dismantled, but the essence of the temple is still here. Never, ever give up that idea, and to know that just like the temple is with us, the individual, his soul is still with us as well. Are you able to hear the video now?
Today's reflection is going to involve an image which all of us probably have an immediate and strong reaction to. It is an icon for Jewish people all over the world and throughout the ages. An image that when we see it, we have a very strong and almost reflex response. I'm speaking of the image of the Western Wall, the only remaining vestige of the once glorious Holy Temple which stood in Jerusalem and was destroyed 2,000 years ago. We're going to use this image to help us in relating to our understanding of our relationship with those who have passed on. So imagine, if you will, in your mind's eye, the image of the temple, the glorious temple as it stood, as it was built by Solomon in its royal splendor, something that was revered by peoples all over the world. And now, juxtapose that glorious image with the image of the Western Wall as it stands now and has stood for 2,000 years in its destroyed state. Go back and forth between these two images, the temple as it stood in its glory and the temple in ruins when we only have the Western Wall. The Western Wall is a symbol of destruction. The temple is no more. And yet, think about the hope, the strength, the inspiration, the spiritual and emotional energy that emanates from that image, even when the temple is in its destroyed state. Now think about a loved one who has passed on. Think about them when they were here with us in the physical world. Think about the situation at present when their physical body is no more. Are they really gone? Have they really lost their influence and power in your life? Or are they like the Western Wall? The Western Wall is an image of destruction, and yet the Western Wall is a symbol of inspiration and hope, pride, powerful, powerful emotions. Think of this image. Think of the feelings that it evokes in you. And now relate this as a symbol to those who are currently, physically, their vessel has been destroyed. But spiritually, their power is as great as ever. We'll take a moment now to reflect and to connect to this image and to relate it to our loved ones.
Was everyone able to hear that? The reason why that's such a powerful metaphor is because it's so beautiful, and that is that the same idea that symbolizes sadness, it also can evoke tremendous pride and tremendous connection. So it's a great idea to think about, where something that we know reminds us of what was once and that's no longer there. And at the same time, Jews, there's nothing more in the world that we feel more connected with than the Holy Temple and the Western Wall. We go there, and when we stand there, we touch the wall, and we feel that we're touching history, we're touching infinity, we're touching the actual temple, even though we know that it's only a remnant of it. But this teaches us that we can bring these two ideas together and recognize that the symbol of connection can actually intensify in many ways. Think about how Jews related to the Western Wall when the temple was there in the same way that we relate to the Western Wall now? Of course not. To us, our Western Wall is so much more powerful because we don't have the whole temple. We are holding on to that wall, and that wall is the conduit for holding on to the whole temple. And that's something to think about, how we can use memory and use spiritual connection of a loved one in a way that's so powerful, because it doesn't have to only be sad. It doesn't have to be what was. We actually have something to connect to, and those two things are not mutually exclusive. The loss and the hope and the pride and the connection are both there at the same time. But all that being said, how about the person who is still stuck? We can recognize all of these beautiful ideas in a classic understanding. I want to go back to the beginning, where we brought these two paradigms of someone who maybe lived a full life versus someone who's dealing with unimaginable tragedy. Can we say that the Torah is guiding and addressing everybody in the same way? Because it's obvious that in one scenario, someone who lives to be 119 years old and passes away in their sleep, or God forbid, a 20-year-old who passes away after a difficult battle with leukemia or other tragedy, would our reactions be the same way, and see that we can look and feel that memory and that connection the same? Loneliness, pain, sadness leaves a void. But how do we deal with elements of anger and injustice that would accompany scenario number two? Why did someone have to die so young? Or why so tragically? Or why so violently? It feels so wrong. This is not how it was supposed to be. I feel cheated. One person lived a very, very long life. They lived a full life, and another person did not. How can we go back to the original scenario that we started the class with, in the paradigm of Stephanie, who loses her 13-year-old son, and bring her in to this orbit to feel what Torah wants us to feel? So the first thing is that we have to remind ourselves again that there is no such thing as an unfulfilled life. Our anger and our sense of injustice comes from where we think that some people live fulfilled lives and others are cheated out of life. And why did my family member, why was I cheated? There is no such thing. Every person has a mission, and that mission is our purpose in life. There is no such thing as a fulfilled or unfulfilled. There may be chronologically a shorter or longer, but a sense of mission it is. And some people's mission is a 1 year, 2 year, 20-year mission, and some people's mission are 90 or 100 years. But we should never make the mistake of assuming that one mission is more complete than another. I'm going to get back to that in a moment, because that's a loaded sentence. But I want to read from you a story that took place to one of the greatest rabbis 2,000 years ago, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, probably one of the most consequential rabbis who lived during the destruction of the temple by the Romans in the first century CE. Rabbi Yochanan had a young child who passed away. And I want to read to you the story of a number of his students who came to him and tried to console him and tried to talk to him. So in the other Rabbi Yochanan says, when the child of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai passed away, his students arrived to console him. And one by one, these were all great rabbis, they tried to talk to him. One sat down before him and said, Master, can I speak? And he said, sure. He says, you know, Adam and Eve had a child who died, and they allowed themselves to be consoled. How do we know? Because it says that Adam and Eve were intimate again. They had more children. So too, Rabbi, you need to allow yourself to be consoled. You're not the first person to lose a child. Rabbi Yochanan responds to his student, Rabbi Eliezer, I don't understand what you're telling me, he says. Is it not enough that I am grieving for my own loss? You need to remind me that Adam and Eve were also bereaved. You want to pain me? You want to remind me of their loss too? The student realized what he said didn't work. Rabbi Yeshua, his next student, walked in. He says, can I speak? He says, sure. He says, Job had many sons and daughters, and they all died in a single day. And yet he allowed himself to be consoled. And he tells him the verse from the book of Job, that Job says, may God's name be blessed. And Rabbi Yochanan again tells him the same thing. I'm grieving my loss of my child, and you're reminding me that there's another guy by the name of Job who also lost children. I'm now doubly pained. His next student said, Rabbi Yossi, says, Rabbi Yochanan, can I say something? He said, speak. He says, the high priest Aaron had two illustrious sons, Nadav and Avihu, but they both died in a single day. And yet he allowed himself to be consoled by his brother Moses. Please allow yourself to be consoled. And Rabbi Yochanan reacts again. He goes, I don't understand you guys. You have to remind me about Aaron, that Aaron, another dad, lost children, and that I should be consoled. I'm crying for both of us. Another student came, Rabbi Shimon, he says, King David had a son. Obviously, you see the pattern, what's going on here. Everyone's trying to do the same thing because they see him suffering terribly, and they want to tell him that you're not the first one, you're not the last one. It's a normal human reaction. King David had a son who died, and he allowed himself to be consoled. And he says, now you're reminding me about King David's loss. I'm crying for my loss and King David's loss. Finally, he had a son. His last student, his name was Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. When he entered, Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch was his greatest student. When he came in, Rabbi Yochanan saw him and told his attendant, please grab for me a set of clothing and prepare to follow me to the bathhouse, because this student is such a great person, I won't be able to hold out. When he gives me consolation, I'm going to have to accept it. Rabbi Elazar came in and sat before his great teacher and told him, Rabbi, let me tell you a parable. Your situation is similar to that of an individual to whom the king entrusted an article for safekeeping, a very, very valuable item. Each and every day, the man would cry and wail in fear. He'd say, woe is to me, why did the king give me such a precious object to watch? I'm so afraid something's going to happen to it. When will I emerge unharmed from the safekeeping? When will he come take it back so I don't have to watch it anymore? Master, he said, you had a son. He was fluent in the Torah, and the Nevi'im and the prophets, in the Tanakh, in the Mishnah, in the Halacha, in the Midrash. He passed away from this world without any sin. You need to accept consolation, my rabbi, because you have returned your deposit in the perfect condition that you got it. You no longer have to worry about what may happen to it. Rabbi Yochanan turned around to his student, Rabbi Lezer, my son, you have comforted me in the most humane fashion possible. Now I can go to the bathhouse, I can shower and bathe for the first time. He was waiting for someone to come tell him these words, which meaning that where Rabbi Yochanan's message to his students was, everybody is different. Don't come and give me cookie cutter consolations and say, I'm so sorry for your loss. I went through it myself. Your uncle, your cousin, this and this person went through it. Let me show you let me give you a book to read about another person who went through it. I don't need to read more information about other people's loss to process my own. Rabbi Yochanan is saying, I know about Adam and Eve's loss. I know about Aaron's loss. I know about Job's loss. I know about King David's loss. It doesn't help me in my situation. I need to be told that my connection and my relationship with my child is as sacrosanct and as strong as before, that his life was complete. He did not leave prematurely. He left when the king came to retrieve what he gave me. The king, we got it back in the same condition that he gave it to me. I can feel relieved on some level that the gift was given back the way it was given to me, and that my child was perfect. But there's a bigger lesson that I take from this story, and that is where Rabbi Yochanan is saying is don't expect every person to behave and react like somebody else. Because what some of these students were telling their teacher was, Rabbi, greater people than you, King David, Aaron, Adam and Eve, Jacob, they allowed themselves to be consoled. Why can't you? Because the simple response to that is, it's great that great people can do that. I'm me. Don't expect me to behave like anybody else. I need to be ready when I'm ready. But his last student did not console his teacher by comparing him to a circumstance or to history or to telling him how to feel, but he delivered a truth to him that transcended his circumstance and his personality, was personally relevant, it was a personal message, and it was meaningful to him. And this is so important that we never compare one person to another, and we don't compare one situation to another. We learn how to talk to the individual and recognize what they're going through. What was so brilliant about Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch? He made 2 points. One point is life is a deposit. If we compare every life to a deposit, we realize that life is not ours. We've been emphasizing this again and again, not just in this class, in multiple classes. If we start with the premise that everything that we have, including our talent, our opportunity, everything that we achieve, all of our accomplishments, it really belongs to God. We start with 0, and whatever we are given, whether it's a day or 120 years, whether it's a healthy body or a less than fully functioning body, it's all a plus. It's all a blessing because it was given to us. When you give somebody to something, you say thank you. It's a gift. You don't say, well, couldn't you have given me something a little better? If we would see our lives as something that belongs to us, then surely that something that we inherently deserve, of course we would feel cheated and robbed by death. Especially when we would compare ourselves to other people and have feelings of anger and injustice, if we're going to compare the gift that we got versus the gift that other people got and what we think we should have been given. But, right, we've all been there, whether it's Hanukkah, Pesach, any other holiday, when you start giving gifts and you start looking at what everybody else got. No matter what you get, you're not going to be happy if you can look at what somebody else got. And what do we say? You get what you get. You don't get upset, meaning we tell it to our children, because hasameach bechelko, being happy with your lot in life, is not just a phrase. There's no other way to be happy in life because the gift that you have is your gift. There's always going to be a reason for you to be resentful if you're measuring your gift versus all the other gifts out there. We don't, but it's not promised. That's not your gift. that person is also measuring his gift against somebody else and he's resentful. But if we recognize every moment of life as a deposit from God, our entire perspective must change. Whatever we require to accomplish our purpose in life, we will appreciate. Yes, we may have moments of jealousy and anger. Those are emotions that God gives us too. But ultimately, we have to realize they're somewhat misguided on a subtle level. So we need to connect to that image that life is a deposit. That's the first thing that Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch tells Rabbi Yochanan 2,000 years ago that allows him to move on, to recognize that you were not cheated. Your child was not cheated. You got a gift. You may have not have gotten the gift that you feel you deserve or you want, but that's the gift giver. That's not you. A gift, a recipient doesn't decide the nature of a gift. Number two is fulfillment. Rabbi Elazar's second point was Rabbi Yochanan's young deceased child had led a good life. He had studied diligently. He was a proper, observant Jew. He was a scholar to the degree that he was able to. He left this world clean. He accomplished a great deal, he says. He studied. Rabbi Elazar, you said you studied all of Tanakh. He studied the Mishnah, the ethical teachings. This is an extension of the first point. Life is a deposit, and it is given to us for exactly the amount of time necessary to fulfill that which we came into the world for. God knows when we come into the world how long that deposit is for. And if we believe and we know that our mission and our fixed period of time that we have to fulfill it is finite, we will consider that everything we have to use that time properly to fulfill it, because the deposit and the mission go hand in hand. And so finally he tells his teacher, considering all that this young child accomplished in a short time that he was here in this physical world, he apparently had an unbelievably successful mission. Some people need 80, 90, 100 years. Some people need a whole life to study the whole Torah. Your son did it in a very short period of time. His life was not cut short. His soul lived a full life. For his soul, that was the full life. In other words, to summarize, number one, how can we help someone who's stuck in feelings of injustice, guilt, depression, sadness, anger, denial? These are all common emotional reactions, as you see on your screen. Is by recognizing, number one, of two things that'll help us. Life is a deposit. Whatever we get is fair and just. Life was never ours in the first place to be taken away from us in order to be resentful. Number two, the terms of the deposit are dictated by the mission that we are given. And someone who leaves this world early did not miss out on anything in terms of the mission. Certainly we may feel that way. But if we believe that we are mission-oriented, then when we live that life, that is the nature and definition of a full life. Rabbi Yochanan was consoled by this because he was made to feel that he returned his deposit in the perfect condition that he got. So I just want to catch up on your screen because we are getting to the end of this an emotionally taxing journey. And that is to realize, number one, to accept everyone is different and to acknowledge everyone is different. Everybody can be offered a path to comfort if it's individualized to that person and not comparing it to any other situation in life, because no two human beings are the same and no two people are going to respond the same. But the Torah gives us a path that every person can connect to, because what is true for all of us are those two crucial points that you see on your screen right now. If we always remember these 2 points, all of us, no matter whatever situation we are in, can at least begin that journey back. Finally, the last point I want to talk about tonight is the things that we can do proactively. When the Kaddish, the great Rabbi Aaron of Kalin said that when children say Kaddish for their parents, when we say Kaddish for a loved one, It's not just making us feel good that we're doing something for them. He says you should know it's like sending them regards. This is what he says. He says when people say Kaddish, it's like sending them regards. When you learn a chapter of Mishnah, it's like sending them a letter. When you fulfill a mitzvah and a good deed for the benefit of their souls, it's like sending them an entire parcel. Think about these three things on your screen. Kaddish is hello, how are you? I'm sending you regards. When I study something, a word of Torah, it's like I'm sending you a letter. I'm communicating with you. And when we do a mitzvah, I'm sending you a parcel if I'm doing the mitzvah in their memory. So while we cannot give physical things, we can give them spiritual gifts. Nothing gives greater spiritual pleasure to a soul than seeing their loved ones leading ethical lives, serving God and doing what God wants us to do. So if we were to know that we can have this relationship continuously, it would alleviate some of the things, the common things that mourners go through. Because the guilt of what we can make many of us perceive as a lost opportunity to right the wrongs that maybe we have committed against those who have passed on. The guilt is based on a notion that now it's too late to fix anything that happened. I wish I could have said what I wanted to say before they passed away. I wish I could have done for them. I wish I could have spent more time. But this, in a way, is a little bit erroneous. Why? Because it is never too late to improve our relationship with the deceased and make up for our previous lack of sensitivity. We cannot give them physical things. We can't go on vacation with them, but we can continue to give them regards, letters, and parcels.
When a loved one passes away, Jewish law calls upon the immediate family to experience the rite of Shiva. Approximately 7 days are spent in mourning and receiving comfort from visitors. A doctor, a rabbi, and an acclaimed lecturer offer personal reflections on the rite of Shiva.
When someone dies, the relationship with the deceased doesn't end. The relationship with the person who died continues. It just changes from a face-to-face interpersonal relationship to a relationship of memories, to a relationship of legacies. By engaging the mourners in this process, you're helping them make that shift.
The purpose of Shiva is meant for the mourner to be able to take that time aside from the affairs of life and affairs of the world, to contemplate, to introspect, and to share with others the life they had, with the person they loved. People come to visit and console and try to bring comfort to the mourner.
The structure of it and the formality of it, it gives a sense of relief. You know, when you're grieving, it's very all over the place, very hard to contain. And the structure of the Shiva brings a relief and a sense of conformity, which is quite redeeming.
If you want to help comfort the griever, what you're in essence doing by taking an interest in the person who's died is helping that person preserve his life.
I remember hearing people say things to me that was almost like they said it and the words stopped right here. But days and weeks and months later, they slowly made their way in.
The point of the Shiva is not to come up with anything brilliantly comforting to say, because there really isn't anything to say. Rather, it's just simply to be there.
One person who lost a toddler under very, very tragic circumstances told me what was the most comforting visit all week. And I'll say it the way he said it. He said an older gentleman with a lot of life experience came in. He said he sat in front of him and he asked to see a picture of his daughter. He gave him the picture. He looked at the picture. He cried for 10 minutes straight. He gave the picture back. He said the traditional verse that you say as you leave, and that was it. And he said that was, without a doubt, the most comforting visit.
But in retrospect, I have to say that that week of the passage between one reality and the next reality. Somehow, I have to believe, in His infinite wisdom, God saw to it that this passage not be taken alone, even while feeling lonely.
Take on a mitzvah. Do something, and it can be tiny, but I'm going to do it in memory of this person, and especially if it fits with that person. That's comforting. Now the world's a slightly better place because of that person.
As we conclude, some basic laws of Shiva. Again, these are things that we pray that none of us have to go through, but to know that when you go there, you realize why we do this. We cover mirrors and pictures to reflect on the ideas of truth, not on vanity. Mourners remain in a house of mourning. We sit on low stools, no leather footwear. We avoid listening to music. We don't shave our haircuts. We even avoid Torah study, because studying Torah, as much as you're enjoying this evening tonight, because Torah brings joy, we want to focus on the solemnity of that week. We don't study Torah during that week because we don't even want to distract. Torah can be a distraction, right? This class tonight, for some of you, is a distraction from your work, putting your kids to bed, dealing with your bills, whatever that may be. And that's so even Torah that gives you joy, we abstain from for that week. Here you see, by having so many things to focus on, it gives us a vehicle to channel our grief, but also to feel that we are walking through a tunnel, but we are not walking alone. And as the gentleman said in the video just before, the greatest gift that you can give when you visit someone, even if you have nothing to say, is silence. Just sitting there is the mitzvah. That's the greatest reward the Talmud says that you can give. I mentioned earlier, just in terms of basic etiquette, when you go to visit someone on Shiva, you should wait for the mourner to open the conversation. Many people feel like they have to ask all kinds of questions or be intrusive and to philosophize. That's not proper. We shouldn't be philosophizing, like saying, oh, I'm sure the person lived, I'm sure that, to give philosophical ideas of what the soul is going through. That's not the time to share philosophy at that moment. And there are certain things that are intrusive that one should not say at a Shiva, to compare a person's tragedy to another person's tragedy. Some people try to compare and say, at least you had this person for this and this amount of time, or at least this person didn't suffer. I hear many of these things, but those are things that are really not relevant, because the cause of death, the level of suffering, while to you feel like you're saying something comforting, to that person, it doesn't change anything. That person is gone. What we should discuss is the person themselves and their legacy. Such discussions allow a person, the mourner, to reframe the conversation, to focus on their loss, but it also directs their grief from passive depression of what they lost into an active mourning, and it shifts the focus to the gift of life that was, rather than what was lost. So by discussing what the person accomplished in their life, the good, the legacy, the impact they made on people, that is things that should be discussed in a Shiva home. Okay, so here, ways to perpetuate the mourner's relation with the departed is
lesson.
Okay, I'm going to. We'll do this. We'll do the summing up of the lesson, and then we'll conclude.
Lesson 3. The mourning after. 1. Everyone reacts to and deals with grief differently. No two people are psychologically alike, and no two circumstances of death and bereavement are the same. 2. It is a mitzvah to mourn the loss of a loved one. Processing a loss is critical to the healing process, and this is accomplished by Shiva, a mandatory period of grieving. 3. The Torah validates and encourages mourning, but only for a prescribed period of time, after which the mourner is enjoined to transition back to normal life. 4. Some ideas that give a mourner the strength to move on. A. The knowledge that the soul lives on and is not diminished by death. B. It is never too late to mend or improve our relationship with the deceased. Though our physical relationship has ended, we can still give him or her spiritual gifts. C. Life is a deposit, and God decides when to give it and when it must be returned. D. For this soul and its unique mission, this constituted a full life. 5. It is a mitzvah to comfort mourners. The most basic principle of comforting a mourner is simply being there. Our presence offers comfort and lessens the loneliness that often accompanies mourning.
Okay, my friends, thank you for a little bit spending this time with you. It's a little long and a little heavy, but if anybody has anything they want to say or share, and we went a little longer than usual, but and even with this, I had to cut some corners, but you can. I encourage you. There's ways. There's more stuff to study here, but thank you for spending this 90 minutes of this journey with us, and hopefully we'll see you, please God, next week into lesson number 4.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Yeah. Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Good night. Stay
And
safe.
I guess there's no easy way to segue, but Purim is coming, guys.
Woo-hoo. Rabbi Sarkis.
Thursday night. So we will be reading the Megillah at 6:30 p.m. at the show for those who are going to come. For those who will be available on this channel on Zoom, you can tune in at 6:30 p.m. as well for Purim, for the Megillah and the festivities as well.
Look.
Yes.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye. Rabbi Sarkis.
Yes.
I have to go to the bathroom.
All right, who's speaking? Okay.